Memorizing the permanent eruption sequence is something we've all learned and forgotten multiple times since the first year of dental school. This technique might seem a bit confusing at first, but watch through, try it on your own once or twice, and you'll be surprised just how quickly it sticks. So let's go ahead and work our way through these steps as we memorize the permanent dentition eruption sequence. The first thing that you would want to do to kind of organize yourself is to make 3 columns denoted mandibular, maxillary, and ear, like we have here. If you took any row within our table, you would expect that the mandibular tooth is going to erupt before the maxillary tooth within that row. And something that you can use to help remember that this is how we're going to organize it is to remember that the word mandibular would technically come before the word maxillary alphabetically. Now, we're going to take a very systematic approach to filling out this table. What we're going to do is we're going to work our way down each column, starting, of course, with our mandibular arch. Now, the first tooth that we're going to begin with, as we mentioned earlier, is the mandibular first molar. Now, this might seem a little awkward since it's a posterior tooth that's going to be erupting first, but once you get past the idea of a posterior tooth being the first permanent tooth to erupt in the mandibular arch and in the mouth overall, the rest of the mandibular eruption sequence actually becomes pretty straightforward. And that's because it's just front to back. Once we get past the mandibular first molar, we'll then go central incisor, lateral incisor, canine, first premolar, second molar, and third molar. And you can see that pattern reflected in our table as well. Now, things get a little bit more tricky when you start to think of how this sequence would play out in comparison to the years. In order to ensure that we're setting up this sequence with the proper timing, we're going to use the following function. 3 space 1 space 3 space 1. You can also think of this as a shortened version 3131 if you remember that there's supposed to be a space in between each of the numbers. What exactly does this mean? This means that when we go over to fill in our table, we're going to fill in 3 teeth at a time, take a pause, fill in 1 more tooth, take another pause, fill in 3 teeth, our final pause, and then our last individual tooth. So what that ends up looking like is the mandibular first molar, central incisor, and lateral incisor being put together in that order, taking our first skip, writing the canine, skipping again, writing the first premolar, and second molar, taking our final skip, and then our third molar. As we'll see once we get over to our year column, this is actually going to be a very nice, convenient way to make sure that all of our teeth in our eruption sequence are lined up correctly with their anticipated appropriate years of eruption. Next, we'll go ahead and shift over to the maxillary arch and discuss that column. Once again, the first permanent tooth that we would expect to see erupt in the maxillary arch is going to be the first molar as well. However, the function that we're going to use to work our way down this column is going to be a little bit different. Firstly, that is because instead of doing 3 space 1 space 3 space 1, we're going to have a space first because the mandibular first molar is going to be the outright first permanent tooth to erupt, so we don't want anything else in its row. So we're going to give it a space on the maxillary part, and we'll do space 3, which means our next 3 teeth are going to be together, space 3 again for the following 3 teeth, then another space, and then our last 2 teeth. But before we go ahead and actually plot these teeth into our table, we need to remember something else. Remember CAP, C-A-P. What does CAP stand for? This is a mnemonic that will help us remember that when we're talking about the maxillary eruption sequence, we're actually going to see the canines erupt after the premolars. This seems a little bit counterintuitive because the canines are anterior to the premolars, and when we were going through the mandibular eruption sequence, there was no problem. The canines came out right before the premolars, but when we're talking about the maxilla, the canines are actually going to come out after both the first and second premolars. So if we go over to our table to fill it in, we'll start with our skip in the maxillary column because the mandibular first molar is the outright first permanent tooth to erupt into the mouth. Then after the skip, we have 3, so we'll plot our first molar, our central incisor, and our lateral incisor. We have another skip, and then we're going to forego the canine for now because remember CAP, canine after premolars. We're going to do the first and second premolars and then the canine. We'll take our last skip, and then we will plot our second and third molars. So now that we have fully plotted our mandibular and maxillary eruption sequences, we can go ahead and fill in our years column. So the way that you want to do this is by beginning with the range of 6 to 7, and each time you move down a row, you want to increase both numbers in the range by 1 year. So of course, after 6 to 7, you would expect that the next range is going to be 7 to 8. However, there's one catch because there are 3 years that we are going to expect to repeat. We are going to dedicate 2 boxes in the year column to years 6, 10, and 11. Now, if we look over to our years column to see how this plays out, the repeat of year 6 is going to keep the same exact range. We're going to have 6 to 7 as our first range, and we'll do the same exact thing 6 to 7 here. But when we repeat year 10, we're going to actually extend the range. The first time that we write year 10, it's going to be the range 10 to 11, and then the second time when it repeats, we're actually going to expand that range to 10 to 12. A very similar thing happens when we repeat year 11, as the first time we write it, the range will be 11 to 12, and the second time we write it, the range is going to expand to 11 to 13. If we fill the year column out in this way, then our table will be complete, and we will have appropriately written our mandibular and maxillary permanent eruption sequences in relation to their correct expected years of eruption. So before we move on to a blank version of the table that we can go ahead and practice filling in ourselves, let's go over a few key points to remember. Number 1, the first molar is the first tooth to erupt in both the mandible and the maxilla, with the mandibular first molar being the outright first permanent tooth to erupt in the mouth. The function that we're going to use to fill in our mandibular column is 3 space 1 space 3 space 1, and for our maxillary column it's space 3 space 3 space 2. Another thing to remember when thinking of the maxillary eruption sequence is cap, because in the maxilla we are expecting that the canines are going to erupt after the premolars. The other thing to remember is when we move over to the year column, we would expect to see repeated years at 6, 10, and 11, with the year range expanding the second time that we write 10 from 10 to 11 to 10 to 12. And the same thing happening the second time that we write 11, where we begin with 11 to 12, and then the second time it's 11 to 13. So let's go ahead and practice by filling this one out on our own. We'll begin with our mandibular column. Now remember, our sequence is going to be 3 space 1 space 3 space 1, and we know that we're going to begin with the first molar. Now since our first number in the function is 3, we can place 2 more teeth, and once we get the first molar out of the way, in the mandible the sequence just goes front to back. So we can plot the central incisor and the lateral incisor. Then we have our first space, then we'll place 1 more tooth. Still going front to back, next would be the canine. Another space. Then we can plot 3 more again, so we can do our first premolar, our second premolar, and our second molar. Then we'll take our last skip and place our last tooth, the third molar. Now moving over to our maxilla, we know that our function is skip 3, skip 2. So we're going to skip right away. And again, the first tooth in the maxilla is the first molar as well. And then we can also do the central incisor and lateral incisor. We'll do another skip. And then this is where cap comes back into play, because canines are after the premolars in the maxilla. So for our next set of 3, we're actually going to do the first premolar, the second premolar, and then the canine. Then we'll take our last skip before plotting the second molar and the third molar. Lastly, we can go ahead and fill out the year column, starting with the year range of 6 to 7, which we know is one of the 3 years that's going to repeat. And when we repeat 6 to 7, it stays as 6 to 7. Then moving up 1 year, we can do 7 to 8. Moving up again, 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, and we know that 10 is one of our repeat numbers, and this range expands. So we'll go ahead and do 10 to 12 this time. Then we'll go 11 to 12, and we know that 11 repeats as well, and we're going to expand this range too. So this is going to be 11 to 13. We'll then go 12 to 13. And then to finish it off, we're actually going to take quite a large leap, because with the third molars, the anticipated range is actually 17 to 21. So this has been a video on how to memorize the permanent dentition eruption sequence. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out. But if not, happy studying.